And they were there to help the resistance and to carry out sabotage. And there was a word. What was the word that they used? Irregular warfare. Irregular, lovely term. Anything and everything, and you didn't play by the rules. The papers for SIS, MI6 missions, will never be released. They haven't been so far, and there's no intention of releasing them. I mean, they may do sometime in the future, but the argument is that is an organisation that is still active, and therefore all their documents are covered by the secrecy laws, so they will never be released. Because SOE was just there for that short period of time, had a specific purpose, they gave so many years, and then they started releasing the papers for those. And where that was a great help was the chap I mentioned, Bob Bodie, Tavara, the organisation was run by Bob Bodie, absolutely amazing man, a brilliant researcher, and incredibly generous with his research. As they released documents, he would go down to Kew every year. He used to fly from Crete, where he was living. He used to fly every year, and he would photograph, copy every single document to do with Tempsford and the operations that went out from there. And he shared them with the other families and the relatives. So that was an incredibly generous man. Without his help, we wouldn't have got anywhere near where we did. It's taken a lot of years to put the story together, but Bob's input has been absolutely invaluable. And he set up Tavara. So that's the difference between those two. Churchill said when he set up SOE, now go and set Europe alight. So those were the instructions. Right, there's a couple of things that you need to know before we go on to the rest of the story. And that one is about the Netherlands, Holland during the Second World War. Holland declared itself neutral, but it made no difference. Germany invaded in 1940, in March 1940. By May 1940, they'd overrun the country, and because it was a neutral country, it wasn't really prepared for it, and they had to surrender. So halfway through 1940, Holland had surrendered and was completely taken over by Nazi Germany. It's a very flat country. It doesn't have many forests. Trying to do covert missions around the country was not easy. It was overrun with German soldiers, and everyone was frightened of one another because they got benefits, some of them, if they handed over resistance fighters, and that's only to the Germans. So some to save their own back, or to get benefits for their family or their business, they would hand over information. So people were scared, but that was the situation in Holland by when this story carries on. And that's something you need to understand. The other thing you need to know about is something called Englandspiel. And has anybody ever heard of Englandspiel? Englandspiel was the German name for what was for an operation that happened across Holland. The Abwehr under Mantel Gisk worked against the SOE. They were sort of their counterparts. And to try to get information out of Holland, SOE tried to send people in to get the information, but also to arm the resistance who were stuck over there, unable to get equipment and weaponry. So that was a big task. The skies over Holland during World War II, certainly up until 1944, were the most dangerous skies there have ever been in to this date. If you look at the number of planes that were lost in those skies, the numbers just, they just take off. So, Englandspiel means the England game. It was where the Germans played with the English, with the SOE. SOE sent 2 agents in. One was called Lowers, and I forget the other's name, but one, you used to put them in pairs. You'd have an agent and you'd have a radio man, somebody who really knew their codes and somebody who really knew how to repair, handle radios. And they would work together. And they sent 2 in. They landed, they got away from the landing field, but they were caught. So the German up there had these 2 men. What they've got was their radio. And they forced them to radio back to Baker Street, to the SOE headquarters. The rules on how they did that had changed just before then, and they put in a second fail-safe code. So the Germans expected them to have 1, but they'd given them 2, so that they could give over 1, still not radio back if they were forced to, not have the second code in, and hopefully the radio operators in London would see that that safety code was missing and be alerted to the problem. What actually happened was that they sent their message back, they only put the 1 safety code in, they didn't put the second one in, and because it was new, the operator at the other end sent a message back saying, okay, got your message, next time don't forget to put your second message in. Or words to that effect. So from then on, the Germans knew exactly what was happening. They used that radio to convince London that it was safe to send the next 2 in. In the end, they captured 54 agents. 54. Out of those 54, they were actually, Gist was, I don't know, I've read his book, it's called Operation North Pole, and he says about himself being such a gentleman and everything, and he wasn't going to have these agents killed, he had them in prison, and he did, it's true, he kept them in prison all the time he was in charge. When somebody else took over, when he was removed to another job, they moved the agents to a concentration camp and 50 were executed. So that's the situation that you need to understand before we go to the next bit of what Bob did. This is the monument that's been put up in Holland for the Englandspiel. It's for all those that were lost, agents and air crews that were lost through Englandspiel. The RAF did become suspicious about it because the lead planes were going in perfectly all right, but a lot of them weren't getting back. And they were suspicious about things. But there are some anomalies with these dates, and there are things that I'm still trying to work out. Because there are things that run in parallel. SOE carried on sending agents out there until 1944. They will say, and it was said, that 2 agents who did escape, 2 SOE agents, escaped out through Switzerland, eventually got back to London, and that was in the autumn of 1944. Germany sent a message back saying, double agents, tricked London into believing they were double agents. So when they got back to London, they were put in prison. They were in Brixton prison. And nobody believed them. That's the story. I'm not 100% convinced that this is absolutely correct, and you will see why. You've got this situation when no good intelligence is coming out of Holland. If you work that out, and somebody did, on the coding in Italy. They were working with Leo Marx. I don't know if any of you know of Leo Marx. He was a playwright and a writer, and he wrote the poem that was given to Violette Szabo when she went out as an agent. Their codes were based on poems and books. Eventually, they found that they needed to get original poems to give them original poems to the agents, because as code breaking got better, and as they started to bring in sort of mechanical ways of sorting codes, common words were picked up and patterns of words were picked up, which meant that they could often identify a famous poem or a book. So he started with the original ones. And Leo Marx wrote the poem, The Life That I Have. Do you know that one? It's a beautiful, beautiful poem. And he wrote it for his, but he wrote it for his fiancée, who was killed in a plane crash. And when Violette was going out, he gave it to her as her code. But what happened was he was suspicious, or one of his best operators, and I'm sure it's him or one of his better operators that he was with, was suspicious about the perfection of the record, of the radio signals, the Morse code that was coming back. It was too perfect. If you're operating under difficult conditions in the field, you are going to make mistakes. Nobody ever made a mistake. They were absolutely perfect. And to them, that smacked of German efficiency, not of their agents working in the field. So, when one of these messages came back, they replied with, "Thank you, message HH." And the operator at the other end, in Holland, sent HH back, because it was protocol within German official documents to put Heil Hitler, HH, at the end of your messages. It was automatic. They were so conditioned to use that when the German at the other end got HH on a message, he automatically, before he could stop himself, did HH back and proved that it wasn't the agent that was sending that message. When they reported that to people above them, and this is in the end, towards the end of 42, 43, not after the other two escaped in May 44, they were told, keep quiet. Don't bother, if you're making a mistake, ignore it. We're not doing it, don't do anything about it, leave it. So there's a bit of an anomaly here, but because the next part of it is to do with the SIS, MI6, and I'm never going to be able to find those documents, it's a bit of a problem. But to me, this doesn't sound right, but they don't really, you know. Anyway, in 1943, Bob and his crew were tasked with taking two agents and dropping them behind the lines in occupied Germany. The two agents, this is the crew, plus there was one Royal Canadian Air Force chap who I held a photograph for. These five were the five that were on that Stoessel HCU photograph. They've been pals from then. They stayed together in their crews, and they died together at the end. They were part of the final crew. The other members of that final crew were Pride Watson over there, Robin Pride Watson, who transferred from the army, and Sergeant Blanchard, Norman Blanchard, who was the only one who had a child. He was married with a child. Two of the others were married, but he was married with a child. One of my tasks doing this has been to find the families of all the crew, to tell them what their relative did, because more than anywhere else, it happened with the RAF anyway, because your plane would go down in France or Holland or whatever, and you'd be buried out there. But with the secret squadrons, you were never told where they were or what they were doing. Their families couldn't know what they were doing, and they were told stories to cover their backs, covered, stopped families asking questions. The Royal Canadian Air Force member, Maynard Hazlitt Moore, who was with them, his family came over in the 1960s to try and find out the truth, because they thought he was a pathfinder working in France, over France, and his body washed up on a shore in Holland. No explanation, was never told anything, no other information about it. Norman Blanchard, I've spoken to his son, and we did keep in touch occasionally, and Eddie, his son, was 3 years old when he last saw his father, and he remembers seeing him and his mum, his dad and his mum, walk away from the house, because they were living with his grandparents, because they'd already been bombed out from one house, and so they moved in with his grandparents, and he watched his father walk to the corner of the street. But his father, Norman, was a flight engineer. And what the family knew, the word engineer sounds like a mechanic, sounds like somebody who's working in a workshop or on the airfield, repairing things. Never crossed their mind he was actually getting into a plane and going somewhere. He let them think that. So that was his story, and they all had stories like that. So the families, if they were missing one of these secret missions, if they didn't come back, they had no idea even who they were flying, what squadron they were in, where they were flying, anything. They stood no chance of finding out what had happened to them. Because 4 of this crew washed up on the shore, we found out. We knew where they were, and gradually, as I say, and because Gran went through the archives so thoroughly, we had the 161 squadron written into those letters, we've been able to find out some of their story. So, this, by the way, is a Handley Page Halifax. This one, there are only 2 complete Halifax left in the world. None of them fly. They're hoping to actually produce one that flies, but at the moment there's only 2 complete ones, and they don't fly. One is in Ontario, in Canada, and this one is at the York Air Museum, and it's made up of parts of several Halifax planes put together. Bob actually flew a Mark V, which was the last of the Halifaxes that were built. And the wingspan on it is 104 foot 4 inches. It's 2 foot wider than a Lancaster. So if you have seen the Lancaster go over on the Battle of Britain flight, it was 2 foot bigger, wider. That person standing there is my husband, who's 6'1". That plane is over 20 foot high to the camera. It is a massive plane. It dominates that hangar. The pilot there, Bob, was 19, turned 20 at the end of 1942, and he was in charge of the flight. The ages of the rest of the crew. The young one, there was one younger than him. He was 19 and he was their radio officer, Frank Groom. Coincidentally, Frank was from Newport Pagnell. But his family had moved away to London, and I hadn't managed to find that family, but his cousin found us, because they restored the monument, the war memorial at the Radcliffe School, and they put it on the website, and he followed the school's website. And he saw my name there, that I was going to talk on this. And he asked the school if they would put us in touch, and so we actually met his cousin and learned more about his younger life. And Frank Groom, the radio officer, and Ron Hedge that we met, his cousin, had also lived in Newport Pagnell, and with Bob they were all friends. They were friends when they were young kids. But then the family moved to London, and by coincidence, Frank ended up back with Bob as part of his crew. He was the one known as Groom by somebody instead of Groom on the transport thing. So this is the vehicle. They were looking up, they were flying in. The crew ranged up to 32 years old. They were 22, 27, several were 27, one was 29, one was 32, but the two youngest were the radio officer and the pilot, and they called him Skipper. So, and on that photograph that you saw just before, written on the back there, it says Skipper, and then their names round it. These are the two agents that were dropped into Holland. By the time this operation took place, after 1940, when Nazi Germany took over Holland, the Dutch royal family and the Dutch government escaped to London. Princess Juliana went on to Canada, but Queen Wilhelmina and the rest of the royal family were in London, staying with our king. But their government was here too, and so was the head of their intelligence service, BI. Queen Wilhelmina was a real domineering woman. She was a tough woman. Churchill said she was the only man in the government. And she made radio. She took on the responsibility of talking to Holland several times. She used to go into what they call Radio Orange, which was operated by our BBC, and Queen Wilhelmina did the broadcasts several times a week. And she became, to the people in Holland, she was the emblem of freeing Holland from German rule. She worked with, and her son-in-law, Prince Bernhard, worked with Dutch intelligence. And they worked with British intelligence, and they put together an operation to deal with Englandspiel, to counter the problems of Englandspiel. They needed to get genuine, clean intelligence out of Holland before they could deal with the problems of the airspace. To do that, they called back this chap, an amazing name, Gerald van Borsum Wiesman, and he was a cavalier, a horse guard. He was 6'4" and had a handlebar moustache, and I've never worked out how he thought he was going to hide. You don't keep someone that size very secret than he is in my family. But he was incredible, and there's a whole more stories which I'm not going to get time to say today about his daring do. You know, he jumped out of a train to escape one place. He was unconscious, ended up in a hospital. When they realised he wasn't somebody local, he jumped out their window as well. He swam across the river. He got to Spain. And part of that story, once he got to Spain, he got on a boat and went to South America, to escape to South America. And he went on a ship called the Cabo de Hornos. And while he was on there, he met another Dutchman, and he happened to be a military guy. Anyway, his name was Anders. He got talking to him, and this guy said, oh, well, yeah, his father was the local doctor in a village called Grass. And they just talked, and that's fine. He carried on to South America. This guy, Henk Lefboer, was an amazing radio and code man. He'd been on a few operations for SOE, because I've got him in the records. And Bob had dropped stuff off for him and some of the other operations he worked on. These are their code names, St. Paul and Harrow. They had other names amongst themselves, that they dealt with in different groups. But this is what they were known as, their operations that they were involved in were known as by SOE and British intelligence. But he was incredibly flamboyant, dared to do anything. And this guy was just brilliant at what he did. So they put the two together. They brought him back from South America, they brought him back from the operation he was on in Europe, and they brought them back to London, where they trained him to do a very special job. And the job they were tasked to do was to be dropped into occupied Germany, into occupied Holland, and to find 10 other pairs of people, radio operators, and agents in the resistance that they totally trusted, and set up a new, what they called transmission group. And it was going to be called Transmission Group Barbara, because St Barbara was the saint of the artillery, so they chose that name. But the intention then was that if they could get that going, they could get intelligence out of Holland that would help the Allies deal with occupied Holland, occupied Netherlands. So it was British intelligence worked with Dutch intelligence to do this. The agents that they set up, these two, once the plan was that once they set up that group, those other radio operators and agents were not able to contact London. They could contact nobody but these two. And only these two could contact back to London. And these two could only speak to two members of British intelligence, Queen Wilhelmina, Prince Bernhard, and that was it. So the narrow field of the secrecy of this operation was really, really tight. Bob and his crew were the crew that were tasked with getting them there. On the night of the 22nd of June 1943, they flew out of Chelmsford, down over the Zuider Zee, and they managed to drop off some equipment to, there was another operation under the horrible code name, Qatar. And that is up here. And then this, where it says St Paul and Harrow, this is where they dropped off those two agents. When they got there, the agents had to find their way into the country and find somewhere safe. Gerald van Huysman remembered the guy he spoke to on the boat, remembered the doctor, and the doctor's name, and he thought that's going to be quite easy to find, a village doctor in a small village, and they found him. That's why, in fact, they landed there, because in conversation with British intelligence, they worked out that not only was that a good place to go to, but he knew where he could find someone that he could trust in that area, and they found the doctor. So they spoke to him. So I was spoken to some on the ship. He's told me, you're a trustworthy guy. I talked to him. And he was very nervous, apparently, but he said, the person you really need, don't go to the military police because we're very suspicious of some people in it. You go and speak to the village policeman at Erlingen, and his name was Bovink. So from there they went and they found this Constable Bovink, and when they got to his house, he was really suspicious and he was terrified. Was this a trick? Were they trying to get him to prove that he actually had contacts within in the resistance, which he did? And he didn't trust him at all and tried to slam the door in the face. Van Beeson put his foot in the door and stopped him shutting the door, pushed the door back open. Looking behind him, he saw a cupboard in the hall, and on top was a child's fabric rabbit toy. And he said to him, listen to Radio Orange on Saturday night. You will hear the phrase, the little rabbit stands on the cupboard. If you hear that, you know I'm telling the truth. I'll come back. So he said, okay, and he shut the door and he went away. After the Saturday, he went back and the message had been given, And in the translation from the Dutch, because I've had to get all this information from Dutch documents and go through Google Translate and tell me some of this is very, very odd. So Google Translate told me that when he went back to the house, Boving, and opened the door, and he was welcomed as a king. So great, that was it. So from then on, they did establish, and within only a matter of weeks, they established that group, that transmission group, and they got clean intelligence out of Holland, and that clean intelligence changed the pattern of the kills over Holland. The loss of planes dramatically went down, and it had that effect on the war in Europe. Bob and his crew had been on a lot of missions. They'd only been there from March until this was June. They never made it home. The plane was lost, and it was lost. The reports came back that Qatar operation had received all the goods that it needed. They'd been dropped successfully. The agents radioed back to say, "We're here, we've managed, we're all right," and were really distressed to learn that Bob and his crew had not returned home, and they were just reported as missing. And then eventually the bodies were reported. So that was it. But there were no records whatsoever of what happened to that plane. The more I got into it and got to know Bob Bodie really well, Bob had a lot of friends throughout the sort of war history, aficionados, those that really knew their stuff. And he had contacts through Holland. And I asked him if he'd put me in touch with a researcher in Holland who might help me. And I had a gut feeling that they'd been shot down. Everything that I'd learned about Bob, which included that he'd been out to Holland on another mission before that, and that his plane had been really badly shot up, but he'd managed to get it home so everybody safe. And there were other things that comment in the jokey comment in the yearbook all pointed to somebody who was a really good pilot. Plus, if you think you've brought those agents back from different places in the world, you've trained them up specifically, you've only got two, you've trained them specifically to do this incredibly important job. You're not going to trust those in the care of somebody who isn't pretty special and something a damn good pilot. You just wouldn't do it. The likelihood, unless he was a really incredible pilot, the likelihood of being given them to the most experienced pilot, possibly, an old pilot, he was only just 20. So he was some good pilot. And my gut feeling was something happened, shot down or whatever. And people were saying because there were no records of the loss of this plane, it was put down to pilot error, which is what they still call it today. It's an accident, but that's how it's phrased. It didn't feel right to me. And in fact, Bob did put me in touch with a chap called Hoop and Starden, and he was brilliant. He came back and he said, "I can't find out anything about the plane, there's no record." He's got a whole circuit of researchers in Holland that he worked with, and he said, there's no record of this plane at all. So it does look as though it was what they call pilot error. He said, there's nothing wrong with that. When they flew over the Zuyder Zee, they used to fly as low as 50 feet with no lights. So if you can imagine 50 feet over black water, it's pretty heavy. So accidents would happen. But anyway, I said, okay, that's fine. Thanks, Hoop. I accept it. It's fine, because he said it doesn't say anything about the quality is fine, because these were terrible conditions to fly. Fine. So we carried on, I started writing up that, and he sent the information through and told me who the agents were and various bits like that. I couldn't find out over here, because it turned out it was an MI6 SIS operation, no papers available. So he told me stuff I couldn't find out over here. But then after about a week, 2 weeks, I got another email from who, and he said, "My apologies, you were right. It wasn't an accident." He had circulated amongst all researchers in Holland my request for information about the loss of that plane, and I told them why. And eventually, one of them came back and said he'd gone through the daily flight record books that they've got for the German Air Force. Lagerbecht, and I'm probably not pronouncing that at all right. But they found that at 6 minutes past 2 in the morning, on the 23rd of June 1943, an unidentified Halifax plane was shot down over the Zuyder Zee, 7 kilometres west of a place called Urk. And that is the right position for the bodies that washed up on the shore. It's the right time for him to be there. The man that shot them down, we found out about as well, and his name's Helmut Lent, and he was a night fighter, and he was the German air ace of the day. He was the first man to get 100 kills at night, and for that Hitler himself awarded him the Knight's Cross, the Iron Cross, with oak leaves and diamonds. So he was a bit of a hotshot. Anyway, that was all. They went around the researchers in Holland and they all agreed, yes, that was DG405. It didn't tie into any other plane. So Bob and his crew were shot down, we now know, and 4 of them are still under the Zuyder Zee. Some of the Zuyder Zee has been reclaimed, but the part that they're under hasn't yet. There are people in Holland who, the Dutch government has put money aside to reclaim those planes and bodies that it can. And we've talked to them about finding the DG405, and the problem that we have there is that 7 kilometres west of Urk is a meeting point of about 4 different counties, or as we would call them, municipal areas. And each municipal area has to deal with their own. And we don't know which one it's in, because it's a bit vague, 7 kilometres west of Urk. So unless we can get more information out of Holland about, so I know whether a researcher or somebody comes up with something, that is sadly where they're going to be. But this is a copy of the German record, and that's the record of Hill. So unmarked on here also is Nullheim, Cologne. And that's because only after I got this far, I was looking at something else and it came up. There was a massive air raid, Allied air raid, over Mannheim and Cologne on the same night. Over 550 planes were sent out. Protocol was that if there was going to be a raid, they notified the special duty squadrons so that they did not send anybody out on those nights, because it was so dangerous. And they went without lights. They were, they were known as the Moonlight Squadrons. They flew by moonlight, and that was what was supposed to happen. For some reason, that message never got to Tempsford. Bob should never have been in the air that night. None of that crew should never have been up there. But as it was, they did go. They did complete their operation, and the agents that they managed to get behind the Nazi lines did manage to save a lot of other lives by the intelligence that they got out of Holland.
Can you show us on the map about
Yeah, isn't it? Right, now, I haven't got a bigger map of Holland, but you can see where we are there. You can see where Tempsford is just there. They would have flown up over round Texel and then down over the Zuyder Sea and then over land when they went down to do the bombing raids. So Bob's drops were right on that line. Because once they became aware of the raid, everything was sent up. All the German planes, all the defences went up, the flak, everything went up. So for Bob trying to get back, once that was alerted, he's going through just constant gunfire. It was all round the edge of the Zuyder Sea. They had military hardware there designed for guarding that area.
So where do you think it's gone down? What looks
7 kilometres west of Urk, which is there. This place. That's it, just on the edge. It's about halfway down on that east side. So yes, so that's the story. That's the story of Bob, of one of the people on your memorial. And this is the accommodation that the family had sent, and we've got now, with a couple of pictures of a very young 17-year-old in his cadet uniform, and in America, dressed in his workday overalls, just 18, 19 years old. Yes, so that's the story. And all those on that memorial have got their own stories. I looked at those 9, there are 9 from the RAF on it. 3 of those have no burial place. So 3 of those are only commemorated at Runnymede. The others are all buried in other countries. Indonesia, France, Holland. They're all, none of those lads came back and were buried in Newport Heaven. But 3 of them have no burial place at all. So coming up close to the 11th of the 11th, it's a good time to look at that memorial and think about the people behind the name that we all get so used to just seeing the inscriptions on the stone, but there's so much more to it. So, right, so any other questions? Any questions, anybody? They're in graveyards in Holland. Yeah, they are. They're actually buried, and they in municipal graveyards, and they are very well cared for by the Dutch. The Dutch, to this day, are incredibly caring of the British airmen and the British troops that freed them. Hence the Englandsfield monument, and there's another beautiful one of Arthur Wellington, which is sort of in the Zuyder Sea that stands out from going in. And they have memorial services, and they look after those graves. They are incredibly devoted to protecting their names and their stories.